4 torpedoes struck in 30 seconds. The largest aircraft carrier ever built, 71,000 tons of steel, had 17 hours to live, but rewind 12 hours earlier, and the submarine hunting her was already losing the chase. Commander Joseph Enright stared through his periscope at something impossible, something that didn't exist in any Allied intelligence file, something that would shock the U.S. Navy so much they'd refuse to believe his patrol report for years. His hand tightened on the grip, fingers white with tension. In his pocket, rosary beads. On his record, one catastrophic failure that had nearly ended his naval career. This was his last chance at redemption. The target was moving at 20 knots. His submarine, USS Archerfish, could only make 19. The mathematics of World War II submarine warfare were brutal and simple. In a straight chase through the Pacific, he would lose. 12 miles separated the hunter from the hunted. 12 miles and one impossible question burning in Enright's mind. What was it? The winter sea was black that November night in 1944, swells rising and falling with ancient rhythm. Above the surface, a pale half-moon spread silver across the Pacific waters south of Japan. Below, the American submarine Archerfish cut through the darkness, her gray hull barely visible even to her own lookouts. Inside the pressure hull, 79 men breathed recycled air thick with oil and sweat. They moved quietly around valves and gauges, speaking in hushed tones, because in these waters patrolled by the Imperial Japanese Navy, silence meant survival. Enright stood motionless at the periscope, studying the distant contact. The radar operator had called it out at 8:48 p.m. Just a blip on the screen, but something in the way it moved. The size of the radar return, the steady southwestern course, told him this was no ordinary Japanese warship. The question that would haunt him for the next 5 hours was simple and terrible. What was it? He had tasted failure before, and the memory lived in his bones. On an earlier patrol, commanding a different boat, he had hesitated. Enemy targets had appeared in his crosshairs, and he had second-guessed himself, recalculated, waited too long. He had returned to Pearl Harbor without firing a single torpedo. In the submarine service during World War II, such a patrol was worse than disappointing. It was shameful. Enright had requested to be relieved of command, believing his instincts as a naval officer had failed him permanently. That scar shaped everything now. Tonight, in these black waters south of Honshu, he intended to prove that the Navy's second chance had not been wasted. But redemption required more than desire. It required opportunity. And opportunity was racing away at 20 knots. The target was moving faster than Archerfish could travel on the surface. The mathematics were brutal. His submarine could make 19 knots if they pushed the diesels to their limits. The contact was doing 20, possibly more. In a straight chase, he would lose. But Enright had studied Japanese tactics, had read the intercepts, had spoken with other submarine commanders who had survived encounters like this. Japanese ships zigzagged. They turned at intervals to confuse submarines, to spoil attack solutions. Those turns cost them speed and distance. If he could predict the pattern, cut the corners, stay patient, he might close the gap. It would take hours. It would require perfect calculation. One mistake and the target would vanish into the night. Or worse, the escorts would detect Archerfish and send her to the bottom. He turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Bobzinski. "Plot every course change. I want to know the pattern." Bobzinski nodded and bent over the chart table, grease pencil in hand. Around them, the submarine hummed with controlled urgency. In the forward torpedo room, men checked firing mechanisms and warhead connections. In the engine room, temperatures soared past 120 degrees as engineers coaxed maximum power from the diesels. On the bridge, lookouts scanned the horizon through binoculars, searching for the dark shapes of Japanese destroyers. Everyone knew what was at stake. This was no merchantman carrying rice or fuel. This was a major warship, possibly one of the legendary battleships, and sinking it could change the calculus of the Pacific War. What Enright could not know, what would shock U.S. naval intelligence so much they'd refuse to believe his report for years, was that he had stumbled upon Japan's greatest secret. The ship moving through the darkness ahead was Shinano, 71,890 tons of steel and desperation. The largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. Converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, armored like a fortress, commissioned only 10 days earlier, Allied intelligence had no idea she existed. She was supposed to be Japan's answer to American air superiority in the Pacific theater, a floating base that could repair aircraft, launch kamikaze suicide attacks, and survive anything the enemy threw at her. Instead, she was steaming toward her death with an untrained crew, incomplete systems, and a curse that had killed 17 men before she ever left port. The curse had begun at her launch 8 weeks earlier. 17 men were about to die in the next 60 seconds, and not one of them knew it. October 8, 1944. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal had prepared elaborate ceremonies for the launch of Japan's secret supercarrier. Shinto priests blessed the ground, admirals gathered in dress uniforms, workers stood in neat ranks, wearing fresh clothes for the first time in months. The plan was simple. Flood the dry dock slowly, let the massive hull rise gently from her building blocks, guide her with tugs to the fitting-out pier. It was a procedure the Japanese Navy had performed hundreds of times. What could go wrong? Everything. The caisson gate sealing the dry dock from Tokyo Bay collapsed without warning. Millions of gallons of seawater exploded inward with the force of a tidal wave. Shinano, instead of rising gently, was blasted forward like a projectile. 70,000 tons of steel slammed into the dock's far wall with a sound like thunder. The impact shattered windows a quarter-mile away. Mooring cables snapped and whipped through the air. One decapitated a worker instantly. Another crushed 3 men against a crane. The hull recoiled and swung sideways, a pendulum of destruction, smashing into the side walls, seesawing back and forth. Workers fled in panic or were swept away by the churning water. The carefully choreographed ceremony became carnage. When the water finally stabilized, 17 men were dead. 43 were injured. Some bodies were never recovered, swept out to sea, or crushed beyond recognition. The ship herself, miraculously, suffered no fundamental structural damage. Her hull bore dents and scrapes, but her integrity held. The human cost, however, was only part of the tragedy. To Japanese sailors, ships possessed spirits. They were living things that required honor and proper ritual. A launch marked by death was the worst possible omen. The kami had rejected her. The ocean itself had tried to destroy her. Word spread through Yokosuka like fire. Whispers followed the ship's name. She killed men before she touched the sea. She is cursed. Captain Toshio Abe, appointed to command Shinano, tried to suppress such talk. He gave speeches dismissing superstition. Steel and engines have no spirit, he declared. Discipline wins battles, not omens. But even as he spoke, he could see doubt in his men's eyes. Sailors made private offerings at shrines. Some requested transfers, others injured themselves to avoid sailing. The ship's chaplain conducted blessing after blessing, but each ceremony only emphasized the problem. Why did she need so many blessings if nothing was wrong? But wait. While Shinano's cursed hull sat in Yokosuka, time was running out. Because 12 hours from now, a submarine would detect her on radar. And Commander Enright, the man with everything to prove, was about to make a decision that would seal both their fates. The rushed repairs after the launch disaster set the tone for everything that followed. Damaged plates were welded over, bent fittings hammered straight, paint applied to hide the scars. Within 3 weeks, the external evidence was erased. But those who had witnessed it could not forget. The image of that massive hull slamming back and forth, the screams of dying workers, the sense that something fundamental had broken. Work resumed at an even more frantic pace because Tokyo demanded Shinano be ready by November. The deadline was absolute. American submarines were strangling Japan's sea lanes. B-29 bombers were beginning to strike the home islands. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the secret carrier and destroyed her at her dock. She had to sail, ready or not. The pressure created shortcuts that became fatal flaws. Watertight doors that should have been tested under pressure were merely checked to see if they closed. Electrical systems that should have been thoroughly inspected received cursory reviews. Welds that should have been X-rayed were visually examined and approved. The skilled shipbuilders who had constructed Yamato and Musashi were gone, drafted into military service or dead. Their replacements were conscripts, students, prisoners of war. Quality control deteriorated. Tolerances that should have been measured in millimeters grew to centimeters. Meanwhile, back in the Pacific that November night, Archerfish's engines screamed at maximum power. The range was closing. 7,000 yards, 6,000. Enright's crew had been at battle stations for 3 hours, adrenaline fighting exhaustion. In the engine room, temperatures hit 130 degrees, but they were gaining on their prey. Back at Yokosuka, men building Shinano collapsed from exhaustion and were replaced without pause. The heat inside the covered dock was suffocating in summer, the cold numbing in winter. Accidents increased, falls, crushing injuries, men overcome by welding fumes. Each death was hushed up. The war effort mattered more than individual lives. The crew assigned to Shinano reflected this same haste. Normally, a carrier's complement would train together for months before deployment. They would drill until every man could perform his duties blindfolded, until damage control teams worked in perfect coordination. But Shinano's crew was assembled from wherever men could be found. Veterans from sunken ships, raw recruits fresh from training, workers conscripted from civilian life. They were thrown together with minimal organization. Many didn't speak the same dialect. When they attempted damage control drills, confusion reigned. Men got lost in the maze of passages. Equipment was in wrong locations. Orders were misunderstood. The ship was a floating city, but her inhabitants barely knew their way around. Would you have sailed on a ship like this? An untrained crew, untested systems, and a curse that had already killed 17 men? Leave your answer in the comments, because Captain Abe was about to make exactly that choice. November 11th, 1944. Shinano was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was subdued, no bands played, few dignitaries attended. Captain Abe read the orders in a flat voice. The rising sun flag was raised. She was now a warship, though hardly a ready one. Of her 12 boilers, only 8 were operational, reducing her maximum speed from 27 knots to barely 20. Her radar systems were partially functional. Half her anti-aircraft guns lacked adequate ammunition. The aircraft elevators had never been tested under load. Most critically, many watertight doors had never been pressure tested. Abe compiled a 17-page list of deficiencies and submitted it to Naval Headquarters with a request to delay sailing. The response was swift and uncompromising. Shinano would sail as scheduled. The sailing orders were specific. Depart Yokosuka on the night of November 28th. Steam south along the coast. Reach Kure Naval Base in the Inland Sea. There, protected from submarines by narrow straits and from bombers by distance, she would complete her fitting out. The voyage would take only 20 hours. What could go wrong in 20 hours? The escort was minimal. 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze. All were veterans of numerous battles, their crews experienced, but their ships worn. Radar and sonar systems damaged in previous engagements had been only partially repaired. They would rely more on lookouts than instruments. For protecting the world's largest carrier, it seemed inadequate. But every available destroyer was needed elsewhere. The war was going badly. The Philippines were being invaded. Okinawa would be next. Resources were stretched impossibly thin. 3 destroyers would have to be enough. The night of November 28th began with deceptive calm. At Yokosuka, Shinano's boilers built steam. Navigation lights flickered to life. On the bridge, Captain Abe reviewed charts one final time. The route was straightforward, south along the coast, around Cape Omizaki, then west to Kure. They would travel at night to avoid American bombers and stay close to shore to minimize submarine exposure. At 6 p.m., mooring lines were cast off. Tugs nudged the massive bulk away from the pier. Her screws began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering power. The great ship moved under her own power for the first time. Despite everything, the rushed construction, the cursed launch, the incomplete systems, she was magnificent. Her hull stretched nearly 900 feet. Her flight deck rose 60 feet above the water. She was, by any measure, an engineering triumph. The 3 destroyers took up screening positions, Isokaze in the lead, Yukikaze and Hamikaze on the flanks. Together, the 4 ships headed for the harbor entrance and the open sea beyond. As they passed through the submarine nets, several crew members noticed a dead albatross floating in the water, its white wings spread like a surrender flag. Another omen, another whisper of the curse. 30 miles to the south, Archerfish was beginning her patrol. The submarine had been on lifeguard duty, positioned to rescue American airmen from a bombing raid that weather had canceled. Now, free to hunt, Commander Enright had brought his boat to the surface to recharge batteries and refresh the air. The night was perfect for submarine operations. Dark enough to hide their low silhouette, calm enough for good sound conditions, just enough moon to spot targets. At 8:48 p.m., the radar operator's voice cut through the quiet hum of electronics. Contact, bearing 020, range 12 miles. Enright was on the bridge in seconds, binoculars raised. On the horizon, barely visible, he could make out a dark mass and smaller shapes around it. Escorts. His pulse quickened. This was no merchant vessel. The size, the speed, the escorts, everything suggested a major warship. Possibly one of the great battleships, Yamato or Nagato. Possibly something even more valuable. Battle stations, he ordered quietly. Throughout the submarine, men moved to positions with practiced efficiency. In the forward torpedo room, crews checked firing mechanisms. In the control room, plotting teams prepared charts and calculating boards. The hunt was on, but Enright faced an immediate problem. The target was moving at 20 knots. Archerfish's maximum surface speed was 19 knots. In theory, the submarine couldn't catch her prey. But wait, what happened next would become one of the most brilliant submarine pursuits in naval warfare history. Because Enright knew something the Japanese didn't. But Enright knew Japanese tactics. They would zigzag to avoid submarines. Those course changes would slow their advance. If he could anticipate the pattern, cut the corners, he might close the distance. It would require patience, calculation, and nerves of steel. For the next hour, Archerfish pursued at maximum speed, her 4 diesel engines straining. The submarine vibrated with effort, her hull cutting through swells, spray breaking over her bow. Below, engineers coaxed every possible revolution from the engines. The temperature in the engine room soared past 120 degrees. Men worked in shifts, rushing topside to gulp fresh air before returning to their stations. Their bodies dripped with sweat. Their lungs burned. But they kept the engines running at full power because they understood what was at stake. On Shinano's bridge, radar operators detected the American submarine almost immediately. The equipment might have been partially functional, but it worked well enough to spot a surface contact at several miles. Captain Abe received the report with grim satisfaction. He had expected submarines. The waters around Japan were infested with them, but he had plans to deal with this threat. "Signal the escorts," he ordered. "Enemy submarine bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters." Abe's tactical situation was complex. His ship, despite her size, was vulnerable. She carried no aircraft to spot submarines. Her own sonar was not yet operational. She depended entirely on her escorts for protection, and he knew their capabilities were limited. The destroyer's sonar had been damaged in previous battles and repaired with inferior components. Their depth charge racks were only partially filled. Supplies were short everywhere. Abe faced a dilemma. If he ordered the destroyers to pursue the submarine, they would have to leave Shinano's side, potentially exposing her to other submarines that might be lurking. American wolf packs often operated with one boat revealing itself to draw off escorts, while others moved in for the kill. But if he kept the destroyers close, the trailing submarine could shadow them, radioing their position to other boats or aircraft. He chose what seemed the prudent course: keep escorts close and use speed and evasive maneuvers to shake off pursuit. "Execute zigzag pattern number 7, he ordered. The helm swung over, and Shinano's massive bulk began a series of course changes. 45 degrees to port, steady for 10 minutes. 60 degrees to starboard, steady for 8 minutes. Back to base course for 15 minutes, then repeat. The zigzag was standard anti-submarine tactics, but it had drawbacks. Each turn cost speed and distance. What should have been a 20-hour voyage would now take longer. Fuel consumption increased. Most critically, the pattern could be analyzed and predicted by an experienced submarine commander, which was exactly what Enright was doing. In Archerfish's control room, the plotting team tracked each of Shinano's course changes. Bobzinski bent over the chart table, measuring angles and times with precision. "She's following a standard pattern," he reported. "If we cut across her turns, we can gain distance." It became a deadly game of geometry. Shinano would turn away, opening the distance. Archerfish would cut the corner, closing it again. The submarine couldn't match the carrier's straight-line speed, but by taking shorter routes, she could keep pace. It required precise calculation and iron nerve. One miscalculation, and they would lose contact. One detection by the destroyers, and they would face a barrage of depth charges that could crush their hull like a tin can. As the chase continued into the night, Shinano's incomplete construction began to tell. At 11 p.m., a bearing on the starboard inboard propeller shaft began to overheat. The massive shaft, turning at high speed, generated friction that the bearing couldn't properly dissipate. Temperature gauges climbed into the red zone. The engineering officer faced a terrible choice: continue running and risk catastrophic failure, or slow down and perhaps fall prey to the submarine. He chose to reduce speed on that shaft. Shinano's speed dropped from 20 knots to 18. The reduction seemed small, but it was critical. Now Archerfish could not just keep pace, but actually gain ground. On the submarine, the sonar operator reported the change in the target's engine sound. "She's slowing," he announced. Enright permitted himself a tight smile. The geometry of the hunt had shifted in his favor, but he knew better than to celebrate. Hours of pursuit still lay ahead. The destroyers were alert and aggressive. One mistake would be fatal. He settled into the rhythm of the chase, patient as a predator, waiting for the perfect moment. Shinano's troubles were just beginning. The rapid zigzagging combined with her incomplete construction stressed systems throughout the ship. Electrical connections hastily installed began to fail. Lights flickered in some compartments. Ventilation fans stopped. The temperature in the lower decks, already uncomfortable, became stifling. Men working in the engine rooms had to be rotated every 20 minutes to prevent heat exhaustion. More seriously, the constant course changes caused the ship to roll and flex in ways her incomplete structure wasn't prepared for. Seams that had been inadequately welded began to work open, not enough to cause immediate flooding, but enough to allow seepage. Water began to accumulate in some lower compartments. Pumps were started to deal with it, but several pumps failed immediately. They had never been properly tested, and now, under actual use, their defects became apparent. On the bridge, Captain Abe received report after report of mechanical issues. Each one was minor in itself, but collectively they painted a picture of a ship coming apart under stress. He faced an agonizing decision: slow further, nursing his ship to port, but making her an easier target, or maintain speed and risk more serious breakdowns. He chose a middle course, reducing speed to 16 knots and moderating the zigzag pattern. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and placed Shinano in greater danger. By 2 a.m. on November 29th, the deadly dance had continued for over 5 hours. Archerfish had closed to within 7,000 yards of her target, still too far for a torpedo attack, but close enough to maintain solid contact. The submarine's crew was exhausted but exhilarated. They could sense they were gaining on their prey. In the conning tower, Enright studied the tracking data with intense concentration. Shinano's pattern was becoming clear. Despite the zigzags, she consistently returned to a base course of 210 degrees, southwest toward Kure. If he could position Archerfish ahead of that track, if he could predict when she would steady on that course, he would have his shot. "Take her down to radar depth," he ordered. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, leaving only her radar antenna above water. This reduced her speed, but made her much harder to spot. Now, she was truly a hunter in the darkness, invisible but watching. The radar continued to track the target with precision. The plotting team refined their calculations. Distance, bearing, speed, angle on the bow. All the variables that would determine whether torpedoes hit or missed. Enright made his decision. He would race ahead on the surface, submerge before dawn, and position Archerfish across Shinano's projected track. When the carrier steadied on her base course, he would strike. On Shinano, the mood was increasingly tense. The submarine had been trailing them for hours. Why hadn't it attacked? Why hadn't it been driven off? Some officers suggested it was calling in other boats, that they were being herded into a trap. Captain Abe dismissed such speculation publicly, but privately he wondered. American submarine tactics had evolved throughout the war. They were more aggressive now, more coordinated. He increased the zigzag frequency, hoping to break contact. It only made things worse. The additional turns stressed Shinano's systems further and slowed her advance even more. At 2:56 a.m., fate intervened. But what happened next would change everything. Isokaze, the lead destroyer, spotted what her lookouts believed was a periscope off the starboard bow. Without waiting for orders, her captain increased speed and charged toward the contact. The destroyer's bow wave rose white in the darkness as she accelerated to 35 knots. On Archerfish, the sonar operator's voice rose in alarm. "High-speed screws approaching. Destroyer bearing 340, closing fast." Enright had seconds to decide. Crash dive and probably lose his target forever, or hold his depth and risk detection. He chose to dive, but only to 150 feet, shallow enough to resurface quickly. "Rig for silent running," he ordered. "Rig for depth charge." The destroyer passed directly overhead, her screws thundering through the water like an approaching train. Every man on Archerfish held his breath, waiting for the splash of depth charges. The submarine shook as the destroyer's wake turbulence buffeted her hull. But no charges came. Isokaze had lost contact, and more importantly, had violated Captain Abe's orders to maintain formation. A sharp signal from Shinano's bridge ordered her back into position. The destroyer turned away, rejoining the screen. The moment Isokaze cleared the area, Enright brought Archerfish back to periscope depth. Shinano was still there, still on course, now only 4,000 yards away. The opportunity he had waited for all night was approaching. He ordered the submarine to surface, running ahead at maximum speed to gain position. The diesels roared to life. Archerfish surged forward, her bow cutting a white wake through the dark water. At 3:15 a.m., everything aligned. Shinano steadied on her base course of 210 degrees. She was broadside to Archerfish. Range 1,400 yards. Speed 16 knots. In submarine warfare, it was the perfect setup. Close enough for accuracy, angled for a maximum target area, slow enough for a good firing solution. Enright made his final observations through the periscope. The carrier filled his view, massive beyond anything he had ever seen. Her flight deck stretched like a cliff face. Her island structure rose like a building. He could see lights in some of her portholes, the shadows of her escorts, the white water at her bow. He sketched quickly, recording her strange rounded bow, unlike any carrier in the recognition manuals. This was something new, something the Navy didn't know existed. "Final bearing and shoot," he ordered. "Make ready all tubes." In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were ready. These weapons had been troublesome earlier in the war, with defective detonators and running depths, but the problems had been fixed. Now they were reliable ship killers, each carrying 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. "Set depth 10 feet, Enright ordered. It was unusually shallow, but he remembered advice from a senior officer. Against carriers hit high on the hull where the damage would affect stability, not just cause flooding. The fire control party made their final calculations. Target speed, angle, distance, all were fed into the torpedo data computer, an analog device that calculated the correct firing angle. The solution was checked and double-checked. There would be no second chance. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered. 8 seconds. Fire 2. The compressed air blast, the torpedo coming alive. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. 6 death sentences racing through black water at 46 knots. 90 seconds to impact. The longest 90 seconds of Enright's life. He counted down in his head. 70 seconds. 50. 30. Impact. On Shinano's bridge, a lookout spotted the wakes too late. "Torpedo starboard," came the cry. Captain Abe ordered full rudder, but the carrier's massive bulk responded slowly. She had barely begun her turn when the first torpedo struck. The explosion was tremendous. A column of water shot up alongside the hull, higher than the flight deck. The ship lurched to port from the impact. Before the crew could react, the second torpedo hit, then the third, then the fourth. 4 hits in less than 30 seconds, all on the starboard side, all between the bow and the island structure. The first torpedo struck at frame 104, near an aviation fuel tank that was fortunately empty. The explosion tore a hole 20 feet wide in the hull, flooding adjacent compartments instantly. The second hit frame 142, destroying the starboard-outboard engine room. Men on duty there were killed instantly as seawater and superheated steam filled the space. The third torpedo struck frame 166, opening the number 3 fire room to the sea. The fourth hit frame 190, rupturing another fuel tank and sending oil flooding through passages. For a moment, those on Shinano's bridge could barely comprehend what had happened. The ship shuddered with each impact, but she was so large that the torpedoes seemed almost insignificant. Captain Abe's first thought was that she could absorb this damage. After all, she had been built with a battleship's armor, designed to survive multiple torpedo hits. But below decks, catastrophe was unfolding. The incomplete construction that had plagued Shinano now became fatal. Watertight doors that had never been tested failed immediately. Some jammed shut, trapping men in flooding compartments. Others refused to close at all, allowing water to spread from section to section. Seams that had been hastily welded split open under pressure. Electrical panels soaked with seawater short-circuited in showers of sparks. The damage control teams responded as best they could, but they were fighting a losing battle. The men had never drilled together as a unit. Orders were confused, contradictory. Some teams rushed to flood counterbalancing compartments on the port side to correct the list. Others tried to pump out flooded areas. The two efforts worked against each other, canceling out what little effectiveness either might have had. In the engine rooms, the situation was desperate. The starboard engine rooms were flooding rapidly. Engineers worked in rising water, trying to maintain power to the pumps. When water reached the electrical panels, explosions of sparks forced them to retreat. One by one, the starboard engines fell silent. The list increased steadily. 5 degrees, then 10, then 13. On the flight deck, aircraft and equipment began to slide. Sailors formed human chains, trying to secure loose items, but it was futile. A fuel truck broke free and crashed into the island structure. Boxes of ammunition tumbled into the sea. The Oka suicide planes stored in the hangar broke loose from their moorings and slid into each other, their volatile rocket fuel creating an extreme fire hazard. Captain Abe maintained rigid composure on the bridge. He ordered counter-flooding to correct the list. He set course for the nearest land, hoping to beach the ship. He dispatched messages to Naval Headquarters. Shinano torpedoed, position 32 degrees 00, minutes north 137 degrees 00, minutes east, attempting to reach shore. But even as he gave these orders, he must have known the truth. The reports from below were uniformly grim. Flooding was out of control. The pumps couldn't keep pace. Half the crew didn't know their damage control stations. The ship was dying. Should Captain Abe have ordered abandoned ship immediately? Or Was his decision to try reaching shore the right call? Tell us what you would have done in the comments, but wait until you see what happened to Archerfish in the next few minutes. Because while Shinano fought for survival, Enright faced his own fight for life. Back on Archerfish, Enright had taken the submarine deep immediately after firing. Now came the most dangerous moment for any submarine, the counterattack. Above them, Japanese destroyers were racing back and forth, their sonar pinging, their crews preparing depth charges. 400 feet, Enright ordered. Rig for silent running. The submarine descended into the darker waters. Every man aboard fell silent, breathing shallowly. They could hear the destroyers above, the high-speed whine of screws, the ping of active sonar, the splash of depth charges entering the water. The first pattern exploded, 5 charges detonating in sequence. The submarine shook violently. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained from the overhead. Men gripped stanchions to keep from being thrown off their feet. But the explosions were distant, at least 500 yards away. The Japanese sonar, damaged and poorly maintained, couldn't get a precise fix on the submarine. More charges followed, 14 in total over the next hour. Each explosion sent shock waves through the water, rattling the submarine, testing every weld and seal. But none were close enough to cause serious damage. The destroyers were attacking blind, dropping charges based on guesswork rather than solid contact. After an hour, the sounds above grew distant. The destroyers had given up the hunt and returned to their dying charge. When Enright finally brought Archerfish back to periscope depth at dawn, the horizon was empty. Whatever had happened to the giant carrier, she was gone. He had no way of knowing if she had sunk or limped to port. The patrol report would list the target as a large carrier, possibly of the Shokaku class, with 4 torpedo hits. The Navy would later downgrade the claim, insisting no such large carrier existed. It would be years before the truth emerged. As dawn broke on November 29th, Shinano was in her death throes. The list had increased to 20 degrees. Walking on the tilted decks was becoming impossible. Men used ropes to pull themselves up the slanted surfaces. In the hangar deck, the Oka suicide planes had broken completely loose, sliding into each other, creating a tangled mass of wreckage. The flooding had spread far beyond the initial torpedo damage. This was the phenomenon naval architects called progressive flooding. Water finding paths through doors, vents, cable runs, any opening, spreading like cancer through the ship. Compartments that should have been safe were filling. The weight of water, thousands of tons of it, was dragging Shinano deeper. Captain Abe made one last attempt to save his ship. He ordered all engines ahead full, trying to drive Shinano toward shore. But with only the port engines functioning, the ship could barely make 10 knots. She was traveling in circles, her rudder unable to compensate for the uneven thrust. The nearest land was still 30 miles away. At her current speed, and with the flooding worsening every minute, she would never make it. At 8:30 a.m., Abe authorized the emergency signal, "Prepare to abandon ship." It was not yet an order to abandon, but a warning to be ready. Sailors began gathering on the flight deck, helping wounded comrades up from below. Life jackets were distributed, though there weren't nearly enough. The destroyers moved in closer, preparing to pick up survivors. Below decks, scenes of heroism and tragedy played out in the flooding darkness. Engineers remained at their posts, keeping the lights on and the pumps running until water drove them out. Medical officers worked in tilting sick bays, trying to evacuate patients who couldn't walk. In one flooded compartment, 30 men were trapped behind a jammed hatch. Their hammering could be heard for an hour, growing weaker, then stopping altogether. Rescue teams tried to reach them, but the water was rising too fast, the passages too flooded. Those 30 men drowned in darkness, knowing help was just feet away but unable to reach it. The end came quickly. At 10:18 a.m., the list suddenly increased to 35 degrees. Equipment, aircraft, and men began sliding uncontrollably down the flight deck into the sea. The angle was so steep that nothing could hold. Sailors lost their grip and tumbled downward, some managing to jump clear, others smashing into structures before hitting the water. The order came, shouted from the bridge with desperate urgency. All hands abandon ship. But for many, it was too late. The list increased so rapidly that hundreds were trapped inside. Others, trying to climb the tilted deck, lost their grip and fell. Some jumped from the flight deck, a 60-foot drop that killed many on impact with the water. Captain Abe remained on the bridge. As was tradition, he would go down with his ship. He tied himself to the helm with a length of line, determined to maintain dignity to the end. Around him, his senior officers made the same choice. They had brought Shinano out to sea. They would not leave her. They stood at attention as the water rose around them, as the ship tilted further and further, as the inevitable approached. Some sang the national anthem, their voices carrying across the tilting deck. Others simply stood in silence, facing their end with the stoicism their culture demanded. At 10:55 a.m., Shinano capsized. Her flight deck tilted past vertical. Then she rolled completely over, presenting her massive hull to the sky. For a moment her bottom was visible, barnacles and red anti-fouling paint gleaming in the morning sun. It was a sight no one present would ever forget. The largest warship in the world upside down in the Pacific, her propellers still slowly turning, her rudder locked in its last commanded position. Then, with a tremendous roar of escaping air, she plunged beneath the surface. Hundreds of trapped men went down with her, their screams cut short as the ocean closed over them. The largest warship in history had survived just 17 hours at sea. The sea where Shinano sank was littered with debris and desperate men. Over 2,000 had been aboard. Now, hundreds struggled in the oil-slicked water. The 3 destroyers moved among them, picking up survivors, but the rescue was selective and cruel. Naval tradition held that officers should be saved first. Some destroyer captains, hardened by years of war, refused to pick up men who showed panic. "Save only the brave," one captain told his crew. The result was tragedy upon tragedy. Men who had survived the sinking drowned within sight of rescue ships. Others, covered in oil, were too slippery to grab and slipped beneath the waves as sailors reached for them. The winter sea was cold, not freezing, but cold enough. Hypothermia claimed those who weren't picked up quickly. Men simply stopped swimming, their bodies giving out, their minds shutting down. They slipped beneath the surface without a sound. When the rescue ended, 1,080 men had been saved. The remaining 1,435, including Captain Abe and most of his senior officers, were dead. It was one of the largest losses of life in a single ship sinking during the Pacific War, exceeded only by the sinkings of the Wilhelm Gustloff and other refugee ships in the European theater. Was this the curse fulfilling itself, or just the inevitable result of rushing a ship to sea before she was ready? The debate has raged for decades. What do you think? Leave your answer in the comments. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic, but had to be hidden. Shinano had been a state secret. Her loss would remain one. Survivors were sworn to secrecy under threat of court-martial. Families of the dead were told only that their loved ones had died in action, not where or how. The official records were sealed. To the Japanese public, Shinano had never existed. The greatest carrier ever built simply vanished from history. But secrets are hard to keep in war. American codebreakers, reading intercepted messages, learned of the sinking within days. The name Shinano appeared in decoded traffic, along with her position when torpedoed. Intelligence officers were puzzled. They had no record of a ship by that name. What had Archerfish sunk? The mystery deepened when Submarine headquarters received Enright's patrol report. He claimed to have sunk a carrier of unprecedented size, estimating her displacement at over 60,000 tons. Navy intelligence was skeptical. No such carrier existed in their recognition manuals. The largest Japanese carrier on record was Taiho at 37,000 tons. They concluded Enright had either misidentified his target or overestimated its size. The highest they would credit him with was a 28,000-ton carrier, still significant, but far short of reality. Enright was frustrated but not surprised. He had sketched what he saw through the periscope, and his drawings showed a carrier unlike anything in Allied intelligence files. But without confirmation, his claim remained in doubt. It would take the end of the war and access to Japanese records before the truth emerged. When American investigators finally examined captured documents in late 1945, they discovered the reality. Shinano had displaced 71,890 tons fully loaded. She was indeed the largest carrier ever built, larger than any American carrier, larger than anything the world had seen. Enright's instincts had been correct. His redemption was complete. The years after the war brought the story into focus, piece by piece. Survivors on both sides shared their memories. Documents were declassified. Naval historians pieced together what happened that November night. The story of Shinano and Archerfish became legend in naval circles, a tale that captured imagination because it contained so many elements. The largest warship meeting the smallest. The cursed giant felled by a patient hunter. The desperate last gasp of a dying empire stopped by a man seeking redemption. It was a story that felt almost mythological, yet every detail was documented and verified. Commander Enright went on to a successful naval career, retiring as a rear admiral. He rarely spoke publicly about the sinking, maintaining the quiet professionalism of the submarine service. When asked about that night, he would say simply, "We did our duty. The torpedoes worked. We were lucky." But those who knew him understood that it meant everything. The vindication of his courage, the proof that he belonged in command, the second chance that he had seized with both hands. The Navy Cross he received was not just for sinking Shinano, but for the determination to stay in the fight after earlier defeats. The crew of Archerfish held reunions for decades. They would gather, these aging men who had once been young sailors, and remember their moment of glory. They told stories of the long chase, the tension of the approach, the thunder of the torpedoes hitting home. But they also remembered Shinano's crew, fellow sailors who had died doing their duty. War had made them enemies. Time made them all simply men who had served at sea. Some brought sake to the reunions and poured a cup for the men of Shinano, a gesture of respect from one mariner to another, across the gulf of war and death. Survivors of Shinano also told their stories after the veil of secrecy finally lifted. They spoke of the chaos, the fear, the sight of their mighty ship rolling over and sinking. They remembered Captain Abe's final moments, standing at attention as the water rose. They remembered comrades who had helped them escape flooding compartments, who had given up life jackets, who had pushed others to safety before being pulled under themselves. One survivor described seeing the ship's chaplain on the tilting deck, still conducting blessings, still trying to comfort men even as death approached. He went down with the ship, his prayers unfinished. In Japan, Shinano became a symbol of the war's last phase, grand gestures that achieved nothing, magnificent failures that only added to the suffering. She represented the danger of believing one's own propaganda, of confusing appearance with reality, of rushing towards disaster rather than accepting defeat. Some Japanese historians argue that Shinano embodied the fatal flaws of Japanese wartime leadership: the emphasis on spiritual strength over material readiness, the belief that will and courage could overcome deficiencies in training and equipment, the refusal to acknowledge that the war was lost and continuing to send men to pointless deaths. For America, the sinking reinforced the democratic nature of naval warfare. 80 men in a submarine could defeat thousands in a carrier. Patience and skill could overcome size and armor. It was David and Goliath written in steel and torpedoes, proof that in war, the smallest unit could achieve strategic victory. The story became a teaching tool at the Naval War College. Officers studying tactics learned how Enright had analyzed the zigzag pattern, cut corners to gain position, and waited for the perfect setup. They learned how patience and calculation could overcome raw speed and power. The technical lessons were equally valuable. Naval architects studied how progressive flooding had doomed Shinano. They learned that watertight integrity was not just about having doors and bulkheads, but about testing them, training crews to use them, and ensuring every seal and weld met specifications. American carrier designs incorporated lessons from Shinano's loss: better subdivision, redundant systems, more rigorous quality control, extensive crew training in damage control. The result was carriers that could absorb tremendous damage and survive, as later combat in the Pacific proved. The human lessons resonate most powerfully. Over 1,400 men died on Shinano, most of them young, many of them conscripts who never wanted to fight. They died because leaders made bad decisions, because construction was rushed, because political pressure overrode naval judgment. Their deaths achieved nothing. Shinano never launched a single aircraft in combat, never defended the homeland, never justified the resources spent building her. She was a symbol that became a tomb, a monument that became a grave. The wreck of Shinano was discovered in 2019 by deep-sea explorers using sophisticated sonar and submersibles. She lies in approximately 4,000 meters of water off Cape Omizaki, roughly where she sank. The images brought back showed a ship remarkably intact despite decades underwater. Her hull, built to battleship standards, had resisted the pressure that would have crushed lesser vessels. But she lies inverted, her flight deck buried in sediment, her island structure collapsed, her propellers frozen in their last position. She is a tomb for the men who died with her, and a monument to ambition that exceeded capability. Today, as nations again compete to build the largest, most powerful warships, Shinano's story remains relevant. Technology advances, weapons grow more sophisticated, ships become more capable. But the human factors that doomed her persist. Ships are still sometimes built in haste. Crews still sometimes sail with insufficient training. Leaders still sometimes believe that one supreme weapon can change everything. The ghost of Shinano warns against such hubris. She reminds us that size is not strength, that complexity requires competence, that the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. The final lesson may be the most universal. In war, as in life, the margin between victory and disaster is often razor thin. One night's action can echo through history. One decision can determine who lives and who dies. One torpedo can fell a giant. On that November night in 1944, two ships met in the darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest of her kind ever built, a symbol of imperial ambition and technological prowess. The other was a standard submarine of no special distinction, crewed by men doing their duty far from home. When the sun rose, only one remained. The ocean had made its judgment. Size and armor meant nothing against patient calculation. Power meant nothing against precise execution. The curse, if it existed, had completed its work. Shinano rests now in darkness and silence, 4,000 meters down, where sunlight never reaches. Her steel slowly corrodes, her compartments home to deep-sea creatures, her story preserved in memory and documentation. She remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a record that will likely never be broken. A giant felled by a predator she never truly saw, a symbol of an empire's last desperate gamble that ended 17 hours after it began. But here's what still haunts naval historians. Shinano had 8 escort destroyers originally assigned to her. 7 were redirected to other missions at the last minute. If those 7 had been there, Archerfish would never have gotten close. One administrative decision. 1,400 lives. The thin line between history and what might have been. What decisions are being made today in boardrooms and military headquarters that we won't understand the full consequences of until it's too late? The ocean decides, and the ocean is always right, but sometimes the ocean's judgment could have been avoided entirely.